Welcome everybody to this April's webinar. We are very fortunate to have a talk today by Steve Railsback, who you may know from his book with also Grimm is with us as well, Dr. Grimm. So the book, well, actually agent-based modeling now. It was originally individually based modeling, right? And then also, being involved in the odd protocol, which is one of the very few, I'm going to call it standards that we have within the agent-based modeling simulation world. So I appreciate your work in both of those because they're excellent. But today you're going to be talking to us about more the sort of like empirical research issues that you faced in the 21st century. So I'm going to not introduce you beyond that, and I'll let you introduce yourself and then begin the talk. So over to you, Steve.
All right, thank you. So what I'm going to talk about is based on a symposium that Volker and other colleagues and former students and I organized at an ecological society meeting a few years ago that we called Yes, Ecologists Can, Models and Field Studies for 21st Century Problems. So the idea was to bring together people who are working on complex and urgent ecological problems using both models and empirical science, and talk about how we can address those problems and how doing so changes the way we do field and lab and theoretical ecology. So my talk is based on an ecological meeting, but I'm sure that those of you in the social sciences and other fields will see lots of analogies and understand how this relates to you. So these are the examples of 21st century problems that speakers at our symposium talked about. First, the effects of offshore wind farms on marine mammal populations. So offshore wind has the potential to produce lots of renewable energy, but it makes it harder for dolphins to hunt. So what's the effect of that on dolphin populations? I work on the effects of hydropower dams on the salmon and trout that live in the river downstream of the dams. Plant invasions, what makes one species of introduced plant more or less likely to invade an ecosystem than others? And then Volker has been working for many years on bee colony collapse, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, that globally there's this problem that honeybee colonies have been dying off, and we don't know the extent to which that's an effect of how farms are managed or how much is due to pesticides or actually how we manage the bee colonies themselves. So I'm going to talk about what I mean by 21st century problems and how we can address them using computational models and empirical research, but then focus on how we can design empirical studies to be more useful by better supporting the models that we need. And finally, I'll talk about how modeling benefits the empirical researcher. I wanted to warn you that things will get a little fishy because a lot of what I talk about is based on my own experience with modeling the effects of how we operate dams and reservoirs on the fish that live downstream, which I've been working on for 25 years or more. And the empirical scientist, the fish ecologist that I work with is Brett Harvey. And so in general, when I use the word we, I mean Brett. So what are 21st century problems? In ecology, these are the really hard problems that we're grappling with now, and they typically involve large scales, rapid environmental change, multiple stressors, so it's not just a cause and effect situation, but multiple things causing complex changes. And as several of the examples showed, conflicts between local and global objectives. So wind farms and hydropower dams have global benefits of producing renewable energy, but they have local impacts on ecosystems. But in general, and extending this to all sciences, we mean the need to predict responses of complex systems to changes and stressors we've never seen or maybe never even imagined before. And I think all of us are familiar with, and it's probably a number of you are working on problems like this. So 21st century problems are too complex to address with field or laboratory studies alone. And even when I give a talk like this to undergraduates in their first class on field methods in fish biology, for example, and I say that there are lots of problems that are too complicated to address with just field studies, they all know that already. There's too many variables that are too hard to control and often under conditions that we've never seen. But these problems are also too complex for simple or statistical models because of things like individual variation and behavior, complex environments and environmental effects, and especially novel conditions. We're trying to predict what would happen under conditions that haven't happened yet, so therefore we have to extrapolate, and that's always risky. So what we really need are mechanistic, often agent-based models. So we need models that capture the mechanisms through which environments and impacts affect individuals and then systems of agents. But modeling is not an alternative to empirical research because models are not credible unless they're based on and validated against empirical observations. So we have to have empirical data to test and build our models. And in fact, modelers need empirical research for several reasons that I'll go through now. The first reason we need empirical research is to give us a realistic understanding of the agents that we're trying to model, whether they're fish or bees or people. Things like their life cycles, how the agents change with their size or age, individual variation, how agents differ from each other, what behaviors they have, what alternatives they have available, what objectives and constraints they make decisions under, mechanisms of interaction with the environment and others. So, for example, how an animal hunts and feeds and what kind of predators might be trying to hunt and feed on it. And then I'm sure some of you have had the experience of identifying things that we've been taught our whole careers that everybody knows, but they turn out to be generalizations that have exceptions that can be very important in some situations. The second thing we need empirical research for is to identify patterns for model design and evaluation. So I'm talking about this strategy of pattern-oriented modeling that Volker Grimm has advocated. It's the use of patterns observed in the real system to first design a model by including the agents and mechanisms, etc., that make it possible for the model to reproduce the patterns. So it's a systematic way to use observations to design a model that's complex enough to solve the problem that we're addressing, but not too complex. And then we use these observed patterns to design and evaluate agent behaviors by seeing which alternative models of agent behavior cause the model to reproduce multiple diverse patterns. The third kind of empirical research we need, of course, is just to provide input data, but often new kinds of input data. So models complex enough for 21st century problems typically require extensive input with sufficient detail and accuracy to depict real systems because we're typically trying to model a specific real system. But often we find that the best input for a model is not the variables or the kinds of data that people normally collect. So sometimes even in a well-studied system, we might have to go back and collect data in a different way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the fourth thing we need empirical research for is to develop theory and submodels for agent-level mechanisms. So mechanistic models contain submodels for key processes and behaviors, things like how animals feed, their physiology that converts food into energy and reproduction, and then behaviors, how they make key decisions. So these submodels can be based on theory or can be strictly empirical, but in all cases, they need to be supported by empirical observations and studies to develop parameter values, to calibrate models, and to test and validate them. One thing those of us that participated in this symposium had in common, we need all this empirical research, and we're often studying systems where there are thousands of studies published, but depressingly little of it is of direct use for modeling. So this is common among people that build these kind of mechanistic and agent-based models. So that led us to start thinking about how we could make empirical research more useful for the models that we need for these difficult problems. So in other words, if I ran the National Science Foundation and got to tell people how I think they should do science, empirical research, this is what I might say. So first is to be interdisciplinary and across level. And what I mean by across level is that we don't need to know everything about the agents or the individuals, but we need to know just enough to model the systems. We need theory or knowledge of the agents that's sufficient to produce an agent-based model of the system. So we don't have to learn every last little thing about the individuals in our system, but we need to understand how they interact with each other and the environment well enough to predict how a system of those agents might behave. And successful teams that do this typically include modelers, physical scientists that know how to model the environment that the agents live in, system level researchers, which in ecology means population and ecosystem ecologists, but also people that research the agent levels. So these could be people that study the behavior and the physiology of our agents. The second way we can make empirical research more useful is to use mechanistic modeling instead of hypothesis testing as the conceptual framework. So I'm sure that in many of your fields, it's like ecology, that we're trained since we're grad students to think that research consists of posing testable hypotheses, often has true, false, yes or no type questions, and then designing experiments with the objective of rejecting or accepting those hypotheses, and then using statistics to test for so-called significant results. But in my experience, this kind of empirical research produces little of value to the modeler. And I have an example here from physiology, where we need to understand how the respiration rate of a fish varies with water temperature. Because the respiration rate is what drives how much energy the fish needs to stay alive, which means how much it has to feed, and what kind of risks it has to take to get the food it needs to meet its respiration rate. So this is a very important part of the model. So a traditional study design that we see in paper after paper is to identify 3 different treatments, so 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees centigrade, do replicate measurements at each of those 3 treatments, and then use our statistics to determine whether or not there are significant differences between respiration at 5 and 10 degrees and between 10 and 15 degrees. But for the modeler, we could care less whether or not those differences are significant. What we really need is a relationship that tells us how respiration rate changes across the whole spectrum of temperatures that fish might encounter. So the useful approach is to use maybe just one replicate for each of many temperatures and quantify a relationship that we can put in our agent-based model. And if you really need to calculate a p-value, you can calculate a p-value that says how significant the fit of these data are to this particular curve. All right, the second example of how hypothesis testing is not as useful as it could be is extracting significant relationships from big data sets. So now in lots of fields, we have technology that lets us collect huge data sets, and we have all these R packages to do all kinds of model fitting to try to find statistical relationships and identify significant predictors from all the variables that are in these data sets. But these significant predictors extracted from big data are rarely useful for modeling because they don't elucidate the mechanisms that cause the response. Second, we can't assume that they're applicable to novel conditions because that would be extrapolating. So we can only be confident that they're valid within the conditions that occurred when the data were collected. And often, even though they can be highly significant, they might not explain that much of the variation. When you have lots and lots of data, you can get statistically significant relations that don't really explain that much. So instead, we need to focus on understanding the underlying mechanisms and processes in the system that we're trying to model. Okay, the third thing we can do to make research more useful is to emphasize relevance over precision. So the point here is that statistical hypothesis testing, we want to make our results as significant as possible, which means we want our error bars to be as small as possible. So we want to eliminate noise. And one way we do that is to simplify the study systems. But this makes the study systems and results unrealistic quite often. So very often, the results aren't really reliable for real systems because we simplified the study system so much just to get clean results. So I encountered this with things like measurements of how fast a fish of a certain size can swim for a extended period that are conducted inside this glass tube where we've carefully eliminated all the turbulence so that we can get reproducible results. But real fish don't swim in turbulence-free water. They swim in very complicated hydraulics. So it's not at all clear that the results from this kind of test are relevant in the real world. And in fact, I found a review of all the ways that typical fish physiological measurements are unrealistic. So instead, we need to make our study systems realistic enough to be relevant to the real world. And if that introduces noise, we can think about noise as useful information about additional factors that might be important for us to take a look at. The fourth and final thing that we can do is to include stressful conditions. So again, individuals and systems are often more variable under stress. And so that means that results are noisier when we look at stressful conditions. And so to avoid the noise that makes hypothesis testing difficult, we avoid conducting our experiments under stressful conditions. Obviously, the problem is that stressful conditions are often exactly what we're trying to model. Many of our 21st century problems are about stress systems, but even when they're not, behavior is often driven by stress. Agents make decisions to avoid bad outcomes like starvation or bankruptcy, etc. So we have to understand what conditions can lead to these stressful outcomes like starvation or bankruptcy. So we even just to model behavior, we need to understand what stresses our agents. And it's risky if we don't measure what happens in stressful conditions. It's risky to extrapolate from less stressful conditions. So again, this is our data on how fish respiration responds to temperature. And we have this sharp increase with temperature because these temperatures up here are highly stressful to trout and salmon. But if we didn't collect those two data points and just had these other ones, we could draw a nice straight line. And if we extrapolated it to 25 degrees, we would get a very different result than what we saw in the experiment where we actually measured under the high temperature, because the response gets more and more nonlinear as the stress level goes up. So how we can make empirical research more useful? In summary, the mechanistic models we need for 21st century problems are supported better when we abandon some very entrenched practices, things like specialization, where we're either a modeler or a behavioral scientist or a systems scientist. Instead, we need to collaborate and be interdisciplinary. Hypothesis testing experiments is the other entrenched practice that isn't so helpful, and the pursuit of precision. So if we're telling people that they can help us modelers more, if they give up these things that we've always done to be empirical scientists, well, what are the costs of being different? What does it do to your professional success if you abandon what everybody else is doing and try to be more useful to the modelers? And so the participants in our symposium talked about this, and we all kind of came to the agreed that in our experience, research to support complex models has actually been very rewarding. Here are just a small sample of the papers that my colleague Brett Harvey, the fish ecologist, has published in good journals that are based on the research he's done to support our individual-based trout model. So now I want to talk about why working on complex models of real-world problems can be actually rewarding for the empirical scientist. The first benefit of modeling is identifying important and understudied topics. So even in the process of building a model, we always identify important mechanisms for which the empirical knowledge is lacking. We go, we can't believe that nobody has ever studied something when we need it to build a useful model of this system. One way that a model can identify important mechanisms is through sensitivity analysis of the model. So that provides information on what mechanisms are most important in the model. So we have an example of this. We asked a grad student to do a simple parameter sensitivity analysis on the first version of our individual-based trout model. And he did that way back in the days when it took days and days and days to run all these hundreds of simulations. And the result was a really big surprise. He found one parameter that was the most important, and it represents how predation risk varies with water depth. So the issue here is that the most important predators on lots of fish, and including stream trout and salmon, are birds that feed from overhead. So they have to see the fish from the air and then try to catch them. And obviously, the deeper the fish is in the water, the safer it is. So our model includes this curve that as depth goes up, the relative safety of the fish goes up. So we understood this mechanism, but there was no real research or data on what shape this curve should have, so we just had to make it up. And then this parameter sensitivity analysis said this curve is the most important thing in the whole model. And once it said that, we started thinking, well, actually that makes sense, because this curve really determines how much of the stream area is safe enough for a fish to even occupy. So after that happened, then my colleague Brett Harvey and his technicians spent a lot of time out in the field trying to conduct an experiment where they trained trout to use an artificial feeder. So the fish learned that it could get food by staying at this feeder. Then they moved the feeder into shallower and shallower water to see how willing the fish was to occupy that shallower water. And they found that there is, in fact, a very strong relationship between depth and the fish's fear of predation. So they produced the first paper on what turns out to be a very important relationship. Another way that modeling can identify important new topics is through failed validation. So this is something else we had some experience with. When model predictions clearly conflict with the empirical observations, you know that there's something to learn. So in our case, it had to do with the effect of turbidity, which is the cloudiness of the water, which results when soil and silt enters the water through things like logging or road construction. And there's laboratory science showing how the cloudier the water, the less able fish are to capture food that's drifting past. And so we put that in the model and predicted that the fish should go extinct under conditions in some of our local rivers that are highly affected by logging practices. The problem was that when Brett had gone out in the field and sampled, he found lots of fish in these streams where the model said they should be extinct. So he knew that there was something going on that we didn't understand. So he went in the lab and did studies on how fish feed in cloudy water, and found out that they have a whole different feeding mechanism that they can use under those conditions. And it's actually quite successful, but nobody knew about it before. So here's another example of where we learned something extremely important that we never would have thought about without the model. Okay, the second benefit of modeling is identifying better variables to measure. Modeling often suggests new ways to quantify characteristics of agents or their environment, etc., that are more meaningful than traditional variables. And if you'll excuse me again for talking about streams and fish, we know that the substrate, the rocks, etc., on the bottom of a stream affect where the fish are and presumably their success. If you can imagine this as a stream, I used a picture where there was no water so we can see the substrate better. Traditionally, fish biologists have just used traditional measures of substrate size, the median particle diameter, and perhaps something about the degree to which the median particles are embedded in final particles. And they use that because that's what river geologists measure about sediment. It's useful for predicting things that geologists need to do, but it's not really clear what those measurements mean to the fish. So when we built our model, we explicitly included three mechanisms through which substrate affects fish. Um, Fish use substrate for first as velocity shelter when they're feeding. So a big rock can slow down the water velocity. So if a fish sits behind it, they don't have to swim as hard while they're feeding. When they're not feeding, they can go in the crevices in the rocks and hide and be a little bit safer. And then third, when they spawn, they place their eggs in pockets of loose gravel. So they need small loose gravel to spawn. So by thinking about these specific mechanisms, we came up with three meaningful measures of substrate: the area providing velocity shelter for feeding, the number of places where a fish can hide, and the area with gravel suitable for spawning. So again, the idea is that the model helps us identify more useful variables um, to measure in the field. The third benefit of modeling is supporting theory development. So in ecology, and I know this is true in some social scientists where we have maybe groups of college students sitting at computer screens playing games that were hoping tell us something about how altruistic they are, etc. In ecology, we have labs full of test tubes and plants growing in styrofoam cups and stuff. So to test theory empirically often involves reducing a complex system to one that's simple enough where we can try to detect whatever it is about the theory that we need to detect. But even a moderately complex mechanistic model can often provide a more realistic context for testing theory than these highly simplified laboratory setups. And especially a mechanistic model lets us test across the level theory. What theory for agent behavior causes the model to produce realistic system dynamics? So if a mechanistic model can provide a more realistic context for testing theory, if you're like me, there's nothing more fun than showing that classic theory produces nonsense in a more realistic context. And this is something that we've been able to do twice with two different models. Trying to use as theory for agent behavior classic theory papers that have been cited thousands of times and supposedly been tested and confirmed in these highly simplified systems. But when you put it in even the moderately realistic context that our models provide, you find out that it doesn't make any sense. And to me, nothing is more fun than showing that something that has been around for many, many years doesn't make any sense. All right. The fourth way that modeling benefits is ensuring research impact. So countless studies are published but rarely cited. But when we design our research specifically to support a model that addresses a really important modern problem, we know it will be relevant and important. And that's because the model is how our results become useful for difficult management problems. So we can be more confident that what we're doing has some real meaning and will benefit the world. Okay, I'm going to conclude with a little bit of summary. Problems of real importance are usually too complex to address with either field studies alone or with simple models. But what we do have some success with is building sufficiently complex, often agent-based models. But those models are not credible unless they're supported by empirical studies that provide basic information on the agents, patterns for model design and testing, input and initialization data, and theory or submodels for the key mechanisms in the overall model. As modelers, we can encourage empirical scientists to make their work more useful and relevant by addressing across-level topics, helping us learn enough about the individuals to understand how they interact and produce system dynamics, developing response relationships instead of testing simple hypotheses or small numbers of treatments, emphasizing relevance and realism over precision, and including stressful conditions. This kind of work often requires a multidisciplinary team and a long-term program, and 3 out of 4 of the projects that were in our symposium were this kind of long-term team. But I like to point out that that's not always essential. The fourth participant was Matt McCary, who was as part of his PhD research, he developed both a relatively simple model about the plant invasion problem, and he conducted both field and lab research that supported and benefited from the model, all as part of his PhD, and he's gone on to a very fancy career at a high-level research university. So it is possible to do this kind of science even by yourself. Okay, for more information, almost everything I talked about is in this paper that we published from our symposium. And I like to point out to the young people who are struggling with publication, it took us 4 different journals before we got this published, so persevere. My models and papers are at this website at Humboldt. And I also want to take the chance to make sure everybody knows that I've been working with Jacob Kelter at the NetLogo program at Northwestern, and we're organizing the first ever user conference this summer, and we just opened registration. So if you're not aware of that, please go to this website and look at the information, and hopefully we'll see you at that conference this summer. Okay.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate you. Appreciate the talk there. What we usually do for the format here, if it's okay, is that we'll just open it up to the audience to ask questions. I'm going to abuse my position as the moderator by asking the first question.
Okay.
You mentioned, here about you had trouble publishing this paper before getting through 4 journals, but you also mentioned, picking a fight against classical viewed theory. I've known from other groups, other places like biology, etc., that when they've tried to do this, they've ended up being marginalized within that community. How have you managed to navigate that? Because sometimes, we should all be scientists and we all should be caring about the truth, but that's not necessarily true about academia, right?
Yeah.
So how have you navigated it? Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, in both of the cases, what we did was there were kind of simple rules of thumb or mathematical derivations that say that the optimal feeding behavior for an animal should follow this simple rule. The first example was minimizing the ratio of predation risk to growth rate. as a way to trade off the risks of where you feed and the benefits. And when we put that in a model that includes, for example, the potential for negative growth, it's very unmistakably clear that that little rule of thumb doesn't make any sense. There was a little bit of feedback from one reviewer saying, well, there must be some way to come up with a simple workaround for negative growth, and we were able to convince him that no, there's not. So in both cases, it was a matter of uh, showing that a simple mathematically derived rule doesn't work under conditions where the assumptions in that mathematical derivation don't apply. So there we could state a good reason why you shouldn't even expect that traditional theory to work, because the context in our agent-based model is complex enough that the simplifying assumptions and the mathematical derivation don't apply. So it makes a very strong case that there's something wrong with these traditional theories, but the important part is that it shows people that they need to be really careful with taking these highly simplified theories and trying to apply them to the real world. So I don't think we never got in a big fight over these things because it was so clear that they just didn't work, and that you shouldn't expect them to work because the simplifying assumptions weren't met.
Did you receive much praise, though? I mean, you effectively should have helped the community. I'm suspecting you didn't because, like I say, people don't necessarily want to hear it.
Yeah, I would say the two papers where we did that have been cited at a moderate level. They certainly haven't become new classics or anything like that. And in fact, Brett Harvey and I wrote a whole book on how to do basically modify classic theory for making trade-off decisions, which doesn't work in a population model because it doesn't account for competition and how the behavior of one agent affects others. But we found a way to use simplifications and stuff, so you can't find an optimal behavior, but you can find good behaviors. And that book has hardly been cited at all. And I think it's kind of because people still think that the problem is too hard and there probably isn't a solution.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Oh, yeah, go for it. Is it? I'm going to butcher your name. So, Matvili, is that correct? No?
Hello, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. My name is Matvey. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Milan at the Behave Lab here. And yeah, my question is kind of broad, but I think I need, or like I'm asking for some sort of guidance or help, because what I also noticed in my research and in your today's presentation is that there is some sort of a vicious circle that theories are not complex enough, field studies are not complex enough to build agent-based models, but agent-based models are not credible without those studies. And then another thing is that even classical models that are cited many times can be nonsense in some cases that you also mentioned. And for me, it's a huge problem because I also noticed that there is a very a big lack of succession, continuity and succession in the field of agent-based modeling. Whenever people start building an agent-based model, they start it from scratch always. And do you see any light in this tunnel, or how do we go with it? Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to think that we can build new families of theory that are become reusable. I'm going to let Volka take a stab at answering this too, but the one example that we use in our courses is this flocking and fish schooling theory. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but where you give your these mobile agents 3 simple rules for how to interact with each other, try to move in the same direction as your neighbors, and um, avoid hitting your neighbors and adjust your speed to your neighbors. And people have been doing this since the 1980s, and the methods have evolved to the point where this kind of model is used in animating movies, and there's been thousands of papers and real-world applications. And so that's the best example I know of where there actually has developed a body of agent-based theory. Unfortunately, it's for something that really isn't that important in the real world. But I don't know, Volker, do you want to say something about steps that have been taken to kind of build up families of theory and reusable approaches?
Yeah, we had an entire series of workshops on theory development and agent-based models, not restricted to ecology, but to agent-based modeling in general. And I will post a link to this summarizing paper, a special issue in environmental modeling and software, appeared last year or 2 years ago. There's no easy answer to this, but I put one thing in the chat here. This is an article about agent blocks. It's a platform for sharing, comparing, and improving reusable building blocks. And so far, there are something like only 6 or 7 by the creators of this platform, but there will be a paper submitted today where we compiled, I think, 13 different decision-making models as reusable building blocks. You can see then these decision models as theories of behaviors in certain contexts. One thing is clear: in agent-based modeling, we will never have building blocks which are totally context-free, but at least we can reduce the context dependency to some degree. And this is a way, for example, if we get a critical mass of people using this platform, we can have alternative implementations of a certain, for example, decision model. You can develop it, you can compare it. So there is a way to get some general theory at the level of the behavior, energy budget, physiology, and this kind of stuff, interaction networks. But it's a slow process. And the simple models I was thinking about, so what is determining the fitness of the model? And simple models are just so easier to memorize, right? Agent-based models, they look like messy and like very, very, very context dependent. They don't look general at all. But I think people are aware of this limitation, and we're really trying hard to find a way. But I mean, this Schelling segregation model is a wonderful model. It demonstrates a great concept. But especially in ecology and also in most social systems, things are just more complicated. And if, for example, in ecology, you have also to take in mind that, for example, forest models, they're pretty established. They have been used, forest individual-based models, since the 1980s. So they're really widely used and accepted. They look very complex, but conceptually, they're very, very simple. It's just vertical competition for light, and it's a growth rate. And yeah, so don't be scared away by this number of parameters and this lengthy description. When you look at the concept, how they conceptualize the world, it's not so complicated. But your question is totally to the point. Yeah. So should we go the simple way or should we go the complex way? And then I'll always say through the hardship to the stars. Yeah. Per aspera ad astra. And we will continue that. I will put this theory in the chat right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Michael's got a question. So if you want to jump in, Michael.
Hello. I first would like to clap up how beautiful and powerful just to hear your message has been. I'm an outlier. I do have an academic affiliation, but I've been an outlier in my discipline for some time, and something that you've treated beautifully, and this is why I want to mirror it back. There's been this question of the treatment of error, is how I would describe it. How do we within our discipline, across disciplines, and beyond the discipline, which is kind of what this picture gets at a little bit that I have here. And one of the key differences, so I just love how you have, for me, sophisticated the treatment of how to invite others to stretch the space of what it means to reorient our patterns and co-inquire in new ways. But not everybody welcomes that, because often it stretches the money flows and the legacy knowledge and expertise. All of these things get reoriented. So the question, I'm going to posit something that I've experienced in social science that you may or may not be able to comment on, but I would still welcome your thoughts. And then the second is perhaps the easier question. So the one of the key differences of social science is that there's a dimension of knowledge that is interiority, is what I would call it. Instead of empirical observation, strictly this side, that there's a subjectivity that plays a role in the internegotiation, the intersubjectivity, how to determine what is happening. We don't know the mind of fish. We do have some inferences about what is happening in human minds, and so this other realm of sense making that is not described by science as carefully, or not, is a dimension of how to hold this subjectivity in a manner that is respectful. And then the second is related to that, is this idea of nested layers of substrates, if you will, of causality, that you were saying agent and system was a way of, and if there's multiple layers, what opens up when you have different layers of causation happening between them. So I know that was a lot, but I just loved it.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I have too much to say about those things because I don't have that much experience. We have, like in the ODD protocol, there's this concept of collectives, where intermediate levels of organizations. So, if you're modeling animals like wild dogs that form packs or social groups and things like that, you can have these multiple levels where the individual and then the collective of individuals, and then you have multiple of them that interact with each other in the environment. But I personally don't have enough experience modeling those kinds of systems to really have much to say about that. Yeah, but I appreciate your kind words.
All right, brilliant. Thank you. Straight to the next question then. Neil, you're up.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I do a lot of work in cybersecurity, and the problem is that many times good data is not shared just because for security reasons, or because organizations don't want to put themselves in bad light for lack of security, showing that they have lack of security. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on how either to handle a situation like that, or to figure out some workaround where some form of data could be shared without, being safe on the people providing the data side? That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. I hate to say this for the second time in a row, but that's pretty far outside my area of experience. And ecologists are like any other scientists, that there are people who are pretty protective of their data, but I don't really have any experience that would help address that. Volker, do you have any? Yeah, it's just something that we don't deal with.
I do find this very interesting, these last two questions, because part of the reasons we're having these webinars is the fact that there are differences within the economic monetization world, that everybody is facing their own problems that others aren't facing, that we don't even appreciate, right? So I think this has been very interesting. I did warn you at the start, this is a very mixed group, right? And I think that's cool because we've got this common language that we can come together with. Okay, I'm going to propose that we're getting very close to time, and I want to be respectful of everybody. Unless there's a quick question from anybody, I'm going to propose that we wrap this up.
It'll be really quick. There have been a new class of indicators. In economics, we used to measure input and output of forests by how much timber is taken, and people began to see carbon flows as a systemic way of seeing. Are you seeing new classes of indicators in your space that might help decision makers in other spaces see the systemic dynamics in ways that have been previously classically misdefined?
I have maybe one example, which is in modeling salmon, where a measure of success is how many juvenile salmon migrate down out of a stream. And our model results, and supported by empirical information, is that the total number isn't nearly as important as the number of big ones, because the big ones are much more likely to come back as adults. And there are reasons why in our model you can have lots of little fish migrating out just because conditions are bad, not because they're good, and so they choose to migrate out instead of staying in a bad situation. So the numbers of little fish are actually misleading. That's the closest example I have.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you very, very much, Steve.
Certainly.
Dr. Railsback. Really appreciate that. It was really interesting, and I'm glad you've been, taken agent-based modeling to that next level, right? Of actually, one could say attacking, but demonstrating that it's useful beyond just confirming other people's stuff. So thank you very much. I appreciate you and your time.